take off these caps, the main caps, and all the rod little halves, and take this crank out. I think it's this one that's shot. I don't know. I'll take this all apart and we'll see which one is bad, and we'll get a core charge. Well, hopefully we'll get a core charge for this and get another one. So got the engine all tore down. Got all the pistons out, all the main bearing, caps. Got the crank out, and I just want to go over a couple things and point out just how the oil passages work, and point out the piston squirter, and just a couple basic things about the VR engine that not everyone may know. And it's also a couple highlights of why my brother and I love this engine so much. Just it's super stout, cast iron. It's pretty small, like the overall footprint, and it's pretty cheap. So this engine's originally out of a 2003 Volkswagen Jetta. And this is the 24 valve version of this from 2002 and a half and up. They were the 24 valve version, which the 24 valve version obviously has 24 valves, has dual overhead cam, has two variable valve time. Like both of these are variable valve timing, and it's just a lot different from the 12 valve that this replaced. It has a lot more cylinder head bolts that hold this thing down, and it seals a lot better, it flows a lot better. So this engine that came out of the Jetta is a 2.8 liter, and this is an engine which is the same exact thing. It just has a bigger bore and a little bit different cylinder head. The valves are bigger, the ports for the exhaust and intake are bigger, the fuel injectors are a little bit different, but other than that, everything pretty much swaps back and forth. But this is a 3.2 engine. So recently, over the last couple years, it's becoming super popular to make an R30 engine. So that is a 2.8 crank, which is what that engine is. You put a 2.8 crank in the 3.2 engine, and it has a shorter stroke. A shorter stroke is good for boost, and it also makes it a little bit lower compression depending on what pistons you run. And it makes it a good setup for boost. There's a lot of guys out there running 1,000+ horsepower on the R30 setup. And also it takes advantage of the later cylinder head, the 3.2 cylinder head, which flows super well. And that's what we're going to be building. We're going to be putting a 2.8 liter in this using stock pistons and stock rods. The rods are forged from the factory. The crank is forged from the factory. The pistons are not forged, but they're super strong just in their stock state. So yeah, we'll put a 2.8 crank in this engine, probably push it to maybe 500, 600 horsepower. The rods are known to be good for, I've seen guys up to 750 horsepower. And with the turbo we got for this engine, it'll definitely be capable of that. So we'll have to see how much we can get this thing up to. So here's a shot of the connecting rods, which pretty much looks exactly like an aftermarket connecting rod, just the H-beam style. So a lot of people do put ARP bolts in these just to kind of beefing them up a little bit, because these stock stretch bolts, I don't know how much they can hold, but it's a common thing to put ARP rod bolts in these things. And a lot of guys just leave these in their build. My brother has them in his build. He got pistons for his car just to lower the compression to 8.5 to 1. But stock rods is definitely super common to use on these engines because they are so strong. Another thing that's awesome about these engines is the cylinder walls are super thick, and it's a cast iron block. So it doesn't really flex. They're super rigid, and it has a bunch, I think 7 main bearings to hold the crank like in place, and they're super stout. So it is a V engine. These cylinders are at a 7.5 degree angle, 15 total. It uses one cylinder head, and it makes for a super compact, small engine. The reason they designed this way is to fit in a front wheel drive car with an engine bay fit for a 4-cylinder. So they had to compact this thing as much as they could, and this is what they came out with. I think the first model was in 90 or 89. It was in the Volkswagen Corrado with the first VR6 engine in it. Here's the crankshaft. Actually, this one is bad. It spun a rod bearing right here. It ran low on oil. Actually, my brother ran low on oil, and he went around to turn, and he said the oil light came on and it pretty much starved it. But we're gonna get a new crank tomorrow, and we'll reassemble this whole engine and hopefully push maybe about 500 horsepower out of it. This is a 2.8 crank, so if this crank was good, you could put this crank into this 3.2 engine And the same rods, everything's the same size, all the bearings and whatnot. It'll fit right in here. The flywheel fits, the pulley fits on the other side. Everything works. Also, every VR6 has the same rod. It don't matter if it's 12 valve, 24 valve. Also, the 12 valve cranks will fit in the 2.8 liters and the 3.2 liters. All the cranks are the same. All the rods are the same. These cams are actually the same with the 3.2 and the 2.8. So there's a lot of stuff shared with the 3.2 and the 2.8. They're pretty much the exact same engine, except the bore size is 81 versus 84. So this engine also uses a timing chain, which the chain goes around the crank right here, and it goes up to this intermediate shaft. And then from the intermediate shaft, it goes up to the dual overhead cam. So this intermediate shaft is what drives the oil pump. The intermediate shaft spins, obviously, because it has the chain going around the crank. Bearing on this side, bearing on this side. And it also spins the shaft that goes through this hole. And you can also see in the casting that it clearly, goes down here. There is a cover on this. There's a gear right here that you can take out. And I think it's a 6mm hex down in there. And you can turn that hex with a drill, prime the engine with the whole engine shut down, like shut off. I don't know, that's just kind of like a good little pointer for a first start, or if you're trying to prime a new turbo, put new lines on it or something. You can prime the whole system before this thing even starts just by taking off this cover, taking that gear out, and spinning that shaft, which goes right down into the oil pump. I flipped this over because it's a little bit easier to explain with it upside down, but the intermediate shaft is right here, and that's the little cap that you can take off to access the oil pump. So the shaft comes through here, comes out of this little boss, and the oil pump bolts right here with these little M8 screws. So this right here is where the pickup goes for the oil pump, and you can trace this pretty much throughout the entire engine. So you can tell by the casting right here that that is where this goes. So this comes right down here, and they drilled through this side, which they got the cap in there. So pretty much this is a high pressure little passageway, comes out of here, goes through a filter, and then comes in here, which pressurizes this bottom. You can tell that boss that goes all the way through this casting, and that provides oil pressure directly into the main bearings. And you can tell that this leads right down to the high pressure little channel. You can see right on them main caps, that's exactly where the pressure comes in. This is the first main bearing, and the first main bearing has a hole in the bottom side. And that hole is right where that pressure little channel is on the crank. So that pressurizes where that hole is, and then it comes out of this, which is where the connecting rod goes. And you can see that that passes right through there. And on every single connecting rod and main, there is a hole. And that passes right through into the connecting rod bearing. So I also want to point out there's a little hole on the left-hand side down there, and that is, this one's on the bottom left, that one's on the top left. So them are piston squirters. And them, there's bottom left and there's top left. So each one of them piston squirters in there get their pressure from this this rod journal right here, which I just had the engine flipped over, and there's a hole in there. So in that hole, you can see in the casting right here that they drilled, and there's a piston squirter in every single one of these cylinders. So with them jets that squirt on the bottom side of the piston, with the factory forged rods that can hold up to 700 foot-pounds of torque, with the factory forged crank, and with the 3.2 liter engine that can accept the 2.8 crank, which is a shorter stroke, and it has dual overhead cam, variable valve timing, 4 valves per cylinder, cast iron block, which is super strong. And also I'd like to point out, since these cylinders are angled, since this one's like that, that one's like that, as these cylinders go up, the cylinder wall, it starts out thin, the cylinder wall gets thicker as it goes up. And the top of these cylinders, which is where the combustion takes effect, these cylinders are super stout, super strong, and these things can handle a lot of power. So after 800 to 1,000 horsepower, these engines start to flex a little bit, and people have reported problems with burning up the bearings quicker. So they make plates for these engines that go in all these little M6 screws, which is where the oil plate sits on, but there's a plate that has a hole for all of them, and it also has spacers, and them spacers fill in the gap between this and this plate, and the bolt goes all the way through everything and holds basically holds these main bearing caps to the side of the engine, and that just supports, it pretty much combines all this bottom end stuff into one. And you have, you know, I think there's probably like 30 of these little M6s, and it combines them to these main bearings, and it just reinforces this whole thing. And with that setup, and with a good set of pistons, rods, and valves, good springs and everything, I mean, you can get 1,000 plus pretty easily, pretty reliably out of these engines. So 800, 1,000 plus horsepower with an engine, any engine, you need a transmission that can hold that kind of power. So my brother here has an adapter plate, and this adapter plate bolts onto the VR6, and this adapter plate allows you to bolt a CD00A, CD009 Nissan transmission out of a 350Z. So that transmission is known to hold, gosh, I've seen guys run 1,300 horsepower in them transmissions, and they hold up. Original factory, you don't have to do anything to them, just bolt them up and go. So we got this adapter plate here, and that is going to be the transmission that my brother uses. So with that being said, I think that wraps up this video. Stick around for tomorrow's video. We're going to get a crank out of the junkyard. It'll be just a good old Sunday fun day, rolling around in the grease and dirt and grime, trying to make these things go fast, trying to build cool cars. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.